I'm going to now pass over the virtual mic to our wonderful speaker, Dr. Callum Matheson. Callum is an assistant professor of public deliberation and civic life and director of debate with the University of Pittsburgh. He has been part of the Navigating Information Fatigue series since its inception this past fall, and we're really happy to have him back to share more on the challenges surrounding social media fatigue. So take it away, Callum.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Jessica. I want to thank Jessica and the Carnegie Libraries, everyone who has supported this series, which I hope is interesting and is definitely timely given what's going on right now. So this discussion that we're going to have, we had three parts of it already about scams and hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and the basics of argumentation and persuasion, which you can find, as Jessica said, on the Carnegie Library YouTube channel, or you can find them by following that tiny URL link. These two, this week and next week, are about social media in particular. And the topic today is about social media and society. The topic next week is about social media and you, which focuses more on the effects that social media has on individual people, their psychology, how happy we are, what it does to our health, and sort of focuses on the concept of addiction by design. So there's going to be a little bit of overlap between these two topics, since what happens to you individually is you use social media matters for its effects on society and vice versa. But for this session, at least, we're going to kind of zoom out and talk as much as possible about the consequences, the social consequences of social media, including political polarization, misinformation, and disinformation. And we'll talk about all of those things as we go on. In a lot of ways, social media isn't really new. When you use the phrase social media, immediately what comes to mind is stuff like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. All of those things are examples of social media, certainly. They're a certain kind of technological media that we use to communicate with each other. But in a lot of ways, the basic idea of social media, the way that it brings people into connection to share ideas and or opinions or anything else, often people who don't even really know each other, that isn't as new as it seems. It's a kind of old function in a way, because before Facebook, there were block parties and ice cream socials and PTA meetings or whatever it is that you do. And before YouTube became a hub of conspiracy theories, you could still hear them from friends and family and coworkers. Those things travel and circulate almost without control. People hear the same snippets of information, the same facts, the same misinformation as well, even when they don't know each other, through intermediaries that were at one point just other people, as well as other kind of public places where you can post information or spread information even prior to the existence of the internet. So now everyone on earth is making the same pasta that they saw on Instagram, but recipes have been shared amongst acquaintances and whole cultures, have their own way of making food. All that stuff existed for a long time. So figures of speech predate a lot of what we now consider to be technologically mediated life that we engage in. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things that are new about social media. There certainly are. And I want to suggest that what's new, or at least new-ish about social media, isn't so much that information is shared socially, or even that you can produce it. That's always sort of been true. What's new, in the sense that it matters for the social implications we'll talk about today, are three things: the individuality of social media, the speed, and the extent of information transmission that exists through these various platforms that I've mentioned already. Facebook, thanks again for joining us on Facebook live stream. Zuckerberg, don't kill my family. Instagram, Twitter, all this other stuff. All of these are mentioned in The Social Dilemma, which is a documentary that we'll reference a little bit throughout the series. And you had an opportunity to see through the library website. It's also on Netflix, and is a kind of dramatized documentary that includes real interviews about the effects of social media. That documentary includes all three parts of this: individuality, speed, and extent, although it doesn't always use the same terms to refer to them that I will today. So let's start with speed and extent in social media. In the 2013 book, a professor named Mark Andrejevic describes our current media environment as infoglut, which is the title of the book as well. Andrejevic argues that we're exposed to an enormous amount of information. We always were, but we tended to be exposed to information about our immediate surroundings and our immediate social circles. Now, we're inundated daily with a seemingly endless amount of information about things that happen all over the world, beyond our own experience. And as a citizen in a republic, as citizens in a republic, we're expected to choose leaders based on how they would handle issues that we know about only through this immense kind of welter of exposure to information. In other words, we live in a society that asks us to make choices of great political consequence based on information that, for the most part, we don't really understand. And the reason that we don't isn't just that some of it requires specialized knowledge and expertise. It's just that there's so much of it. To make a good political decision means that you have to process an enormous amount of information, too much for almost any individual, perhaps for any individual to keep a good handle on. So here's an example. It's reasonable to vote for the presidential candidate who you think would present the least risk of a nuclear war breaking out. That's not hugely controversial, I hope. So whether nuclear weapons are kept on an alert deterrent posture or a de-alerted deterrence posture, therefore, it should be a major issue. If one candidate believes one and the other believes the other one, and that those things have an effect on the likelihood of nuclear war, shouldn't you understand them? But how much do you really know about those things? If the goal is to avoid a nuclear war, and most nuclear wars might happen by accident rather than intent, is an accidental nuclear war even possible? To answer that question, you have to know a lot about the technical specifications of the weapons in the United States and Russian arsenals. Do you know a whole lot about the Minuteman missile? Do you know the last time it's been updated? Do you know that the W-76 warhead is relatively stable, but the Mark III version hasn't been tested in actual detonations, only online and in simulated detonations? Did you know that the W-80 warhead that used to be deployed on Trident missiles might have a problem where it's not multi-point safe, and that exposure to water might cause it to go accidentally critical, at least in part, and that might cause explosions in the warhead? Are you aware of all that? Did you know that de-alerting could help that, but only if the weapons are taken off of the missiles or demated? But is that a good idea? Because it might increase the risk of a nuclear war rather than decrease it if, for example, the Russians really want to start a war in Europe, and that the only reason they don't is because an aggressive American nuclear posture is preventing them. How likely is that, though? Well, you'd have to know an awful lot about Russian history and current strategic goals to do that. To understand the current strategic goals of Russia, you'd have to understand the history of the Soviet Union in some detail, as well as the geopolitical situation in Eastern Europe, the potential points of conflict between Russia and the United States. You'd have to understand where those things link into the historical thinking of Russian strategic planners, and you'd have to understand, therefore, quite a good deal about Russian history. How much do you really know about Ivan the Terrible? Can you say that you can trace a line through Kievan Rus and its policy towards expansion all the way to the current day? How much of that stuff is really relevant? How much of it is not? Does the American nuclear arsenal really deter the Russians or not? What kind of data would you use to calculate that? Well, you could look at the set of all wars, and you could compare the wars that did break out to changes in deterrent posture, the various combatant states that started those wars or were victim to those wars throughout, say, I don't know, the last 400 years of history since the Treaty of Westphalia or so. And you could make then decisions that are semi-informed about the likelihood that there's at least a correlation between changes in deterrent posture and the outbreak of war. And you could project that forward if you think that you know why that should be projected forward and applied to the current situation to make a good assessment about the probability of nuclear war and the likeliness that deterrence actually stops it rather than causes it, and weigh that against the possibility of an accidental nuclear war that happens through a technical mistake or through deliberate or inadvertent use of nuclear weapons. And the result that you would get would suggest that one policy is better than the other policy for averting a nuclear war. Did you go through all those steps when you voted in 2020? Probably not. Did you do the equivalent for climate change? Did you do the equivalent for biological weapons? Did you do the equivalent for space colonization? Did you do the equivalent for every social justice concern that could potentially be interesting to you? Did you do it for economic growth? Did you then compare the way that each of those issues affects the other issues? You can't, really. Even if you devoted all of your life just to processing the enormous amount of information that you need to make the decisions that you're essentially required to make in a republic, you couldn't possibly do it. There's just too much. So what do we do in a condition where there's too much information? Most people take one of two paths, according to Andrejevic at least. One is that you can obsess over that information. You can pick it apart and you can try to make the very best decision that you can. You can try to know everything before you make a decision, or at least everything that matters. This is kind of what, according to Andrejevic again, what Bill Clinton did in 1994 when the United States was considering intervening in the Rwandan genocide. Clinton wanted to know everything. He wanted to know which US forces to send and where would they go and what was causing the problem and what the likely solutions were and how our allies would react and how our adversaries would react and so on and so forth. And by the time he had dug through enough of that information to make a good informed decision, it was too late. The crisis had already escalated and essentially resolved itself in the worst possible way. So asking for too much and to know everything doesn't work. The other solution that people tend to rely on is to ask for less information and just ignore it. This is arguably what, again, according to Andrejevic, George W. Bush did in the run-up to the Iraq War in 2003, the second US invasion of Iraq. Bush didn't really know everything about weapons of mass destruction that Iraq might have and the likelihood that American intervention could do something about it and so on and so forth. Instead, he kind of trusted his gut. Instead of processing everything, reading every intelligence report and interviewing every expert and so on, Bush just kind of did what he felt, just called an affective response. Between those two things, that's how most people deal with the glut of overinformation. They either try to know everything, called salami slicing sometimes, or they try to just do something based on how they feel about the situation. Which usually means doing whatever they kind of wanted to do anyway, or what they're inclined to do before they processed any of that information at all. So that's kind of the difficulty of information glut, and social media magnifies that greatly. Suddenly, you're exposed to an enormous amount of information, but you're also exposed to an enormous amount of information of dubious and difficult to verify quality. Even if you wanted to know it all, you couldn't. You couldn't possibly process all the information that's available to you in a single day. Just the stuff that you see on a Facebook feed in an hour of scrolling through it, for example. For you to verify every story, for you to understand all of its backstory and all the information that you would need to know would take up your entire life. And by the time you were done breaking down one issue, like the nuclear weapons issue I talked about earlier, so much more information would be created that you would have to catch up with that too, which you probably couldn't do. If you like true crime shows, you can't know everything about true crime. There's always more crimes and there's always more crime shows and books and so on. You can't possibly catch up to it because just as soon as you're current with last week, just the production of the week since then overwhelms your ability to read and to know all of that stuff. So people are sort of exposed to an immense amount of information and asked to make decisions that they aren't really, for the most part, capable of making. This isn't just a problem for individuals, which again is what we're going to talk about mostly next week. It creates a serious problem for society and an opportunity for misinformation and disinformation to spread easily. It used to be that to control a society through information, you mostly relied on scarcity. So for example, in the Soviet Union, one way that the government controlled its population was simply to limit their access to international media. It's what North Korea still does now. The Chinese government does this to some extent, the Great Firewall of China and all this stuff. There are lots of ways that you can limit access to information. And historically, that's been the move for authoritarian and anti-democratic governments more generally, totalitarian governments like the Soviet Union as well. Now, you don't really need to do that anymore. Information scarcity in some ways is kind of obsolete. So tyrannical governments still do it. But in a democratic society or in a republic like the United States, you can still control through information without scarcity. You can actually control more easily through superabundance of information than you ever could by censorship and restriction, because there's so much information that you can overwhelm people's ability to process it all and then kind of lead them to make more specific decisions in the directions that you want. There's a classic book on propaganda by Edward Bernays, who was, weirdly enough, was Sigmund Freud's nephew, but also was one of the original kind of Wall Street models for Mad Men, or Madison Avenue, I should say, not Wall Street. If you ever saw the show Mad Men, a lot of it is based on Bernays. One of the things that Bernays said, as far back as the 1920s, was people are exposed to such big choices, and there's so much stuff that influences them in every direction. They can't really make decisions without propaganda. And Bernays was writing in favor of propaganda and said, what you do in a society where, United States, there are more than 300 million people in the country now, any of them could theoretically run for president. Do you know them all? You know all 300 million? Do you know which ones would be the best choice? You don't, and you never will, because there's too many. And as a result, information, instead of overwhelming you, is channeled by organizations that exist to do that exact kind of thing. If you're a Democrat, the Democratic Party picks a few candidates and has a primary and spares you being exposed to every member of the party and then making an informed decision as a result. The Republicans do the same thing. A lot of what seems to be our choices made in an environment of information freedom are managed, in essence, by people who can control the quality and quantity of information to which you're exposed. And they don't do it by scarcity. They do it by superabundance. If you want to bury a story about a corporation, for example, it's easier to overproduce news and distract people from whatever it is you don't want them to focus on than it is to actually eliminate a negative story or a negative opinion that exists. And this is something that people are very well aware of. You don't have to deny that something happened anymore. For the most part, you can just shift attention to something else, or a combination of the two strategies, which works even better. Part of the resulting situation is an erosion in trust. What happens when anyone can produce information about anything and that you're exposed to an enormous amount of it without good standards of determining what's true and what's false, or at least what's probably true and what's probably false? It becomes easier and easier to doubt expert opinion and to make decisions based on simple exposure or based on what you want to believe anyway. So for climate change is a great example of this. People who want to have a good scientific understanding of climate have to do a lot of work. You actually have to know quite a bit to understand even the sort of basic dynamics of climate in any detail. Some people respond to that dilemma, that problem, by just deciding that it is or isn't anthropogenic, caused by humans. It is or isn't bad, based more or less on what they want to believe, and then look for information that confirms that. This is called confirmation bias, and it's a typical way of dealing with not only with a surfeit of information, but dealing with decisions that people have to make that are difficult. And because anyone can say anything, over time, it becomes easier and easier for Gresham's law information. Gresham's law in economics is when bad money chases out good. In this case, bad information chases out good. You don't need to respond. If you want to deny climate change, you don't need to respond to every climate scientist and say, the study is wrong for this reason and this reason and so on. It's a massive waste of your time to do that. It's easier to just instill doubt by asserting the exact opposite. Maybe don't even need to reference the people that you're trying to undermine. Naomi Oreskes wrote a great book called Merchants of Doubt, which is about the beginning of this strategy, long before social media, This started with tobacco companies, for example. There's a guy named Frederick Seitz, who was a famous physicist in his day. He worked on the Manhattan Project, and he made a whole career out of scientific uncertainty. When the tobacco companies realized that nicotine was addictive and that cigarettes were killing people, instead of trying to respond to every study that said that, trying to explain that cigarettes were safe, instead, they just created doubt about the idea that they were dangerous, which is a different thing. You don't have to prove cigarettes are safe. You have to muddy the waters and make it uncertain that they're not safe. This strategy has been adapted to all sorts of scientific disputes since then. It's been adapted to climate change, as I mentioned, acid rain, all sorts of things. And what do you get as a result? You get like the Plandemic documentary. You get Capitol riots. You get QAnon, chemtrails, flat earthers. All of these people look at an enormous amount of information which they don't trust, and they make a decision ultimately to choose something that filters most of that information out. And the result of it is a kind of private epistemology, if you will, where everybody makes their own decisions about what's true and what's false. And expertise doesn't matter so much. It doesn't matter as much as quantity anyway. Expertise is an easy thing to fake anyway. Here's Exhibit A. Look at this. See this guy? He's wearing a bow tie. Would you take his investment advice just because he's wearing a bow tie? Well, if you spent a lot of time on Reddit, probably you would. But he's not really an expert. I watched him poop on the carpet today. The expertise that exists in one place and the simulation of it, just putting on the bow tie and getting on Zoom, is good enough for most people. How do you know he's not an economist? Well, he's a dog, so he's not an economist. But how do you know that anyone that you're exposed to that you don't know individually really knows what they're talking about? For the most part, you can't. You could, in theory, track down all their information. If the truth is out there, Scully, can't you just like diligently find it? Maybe. But it doesn't really matter even if you tried to do that. So let's say that you decided to track down the information to make a good informed decision about stocks without asking my dog, or climate change without listening to OANN or something like that. If you figured it out, let's say hypothetically, that you cut through all of this welter of information and made a good and informed decision, you figured out that what's really behind the outbreak of the coronavirus or whatever, it probably wouldn't make any difference anyway, because you can't usually convince anyone who doesn't already share your beliefs. This is the individual aspect of infoglut that we mentioned before. On social media especially, we seek out people who we like and news channels that tell us what we want to hear, either good or bad. Sometimes what you want to hear isn't that everything is okay. What you want to hear is that the country is falling apart because of the people that you don't like, of the politicians that you didn't vote for, so on and so forth. People don't always choose what makes them feel good directly. They choose what sort of activates the way that they understand the world. And they look for people who believe the same things. Social media, and probably everybody always did, voluntary associations with other people who shared a lot in common with you. But social media has made this a lot worse in some ways because people tend to rely on it for information. A huge percentage of Americans say that they get most of their news from social media or through things that are curated in similar ways. If a lot of your news comes from things that you see your friends post on Facebook, for example, the kind of news that you're exposed to is the kind of news that your friends choose to post. And in fact, if people disagree with you a lot, or they show you things that you don't like, you're less likely to be friends with them, either literally or figuratively through Facebook. You form over time groups of people who are like-minded, groups of people who confirm what you already want to believe. They confirm the way that you already see the world. One term Nick Pariser called these filter bubbles. A filter bubble is like a deafening echo, basically, that comes back at you of your own opinions and hopes and fears, because the only people that you interact with by choice are the people who already believe what you believe. And that's true of big news channels. If you are a Fox or a CNN or an MSNBC person or whatever, you'll choose something that tells you what you want to hear. But it's also true of just the daily little reaffirmations that come from social interactions that happen over the internet as you curate your friends list or choose which accounts to follow and which ones to unfollow and so on. It's easier to fall deeper and deeper into a bubble of your own design. And there's some really easy examples of this that probably everybody's aware of. So white supremacist online communities are one. Everybody in these communities kind of shares the same stuff with each other. So bad science is never contradicted by someone else, or incorrect historical facts and so on are things that constantly get recycled and reaffirmed to promote white supremacy, anti-blackness, stuff like that. QAnon is another great example of this, as all conspiracy theories are. So we already had a whole section on conspiracy theories in a previous presentation, so I'm not going to rehash the whole thing, but here's the sort of core of how this matters for social media. Conspiracy theories present themselves as doubt. Maybe this isn't the way that the world really is. But in a lot of ways, conspiracy theories are really kind of quests for certainty. It's really tough to figure out what really happened in some historical events. And for the most part, you can't. You can't prove that the government's explanation of what happened in the Kennedy assassination is correct. You can't prove that there's not a cult of child abusers who are hiding behind the Democratic Party and, eating babies or whatever it is that the QAnon people have said this week. You can't prove or disprove any of that stuff. You can say that one thing is dramatically more likely than the other. And sometimes you'll be, right most of the time, and you'll be wrong occasionally, but there isn't certainty involved in it. Conspiracy theorists aren't really about trafficking in uncertainty. They're really about trafficking in certainty. When you look at that situation where you won't know for sure that what you've read in the news is really happening, for example, instead of cultivating an attitude towards uncertainty, it begins with accepting that information that's presented to you has to be judged by probability rather than certainty. Instead of all that, you can just say, I don't need to know the details. It doesn't matter that I don't know every detail because you can't believe the media anyway. It's all written by lizard people who have lived at the center of the earth for millions of years, and sometimes they wear human skins and pretend to be politicians and stuff. And that's the Pope and the Queen and Barack Obama, all lizards. So I don't need to know the details of what's going on in Colombia right now, or the violence that's happening in Israel between the PLO and the Israeli government. It doesn't matter that I don't really understand all that stuff because there's too much information for me to process. I found the one magic key that lets me cut through the whole thing. It's all lizard people. It's all QAnon. It's all whoever. Fill in whichever conspiracy is popular with you. So, and then once you expose yourself to other people who believe the same thing, you're a constant reaffirmation of it and very little challenge to it. So these filter bubbles are great opportunities to magnify misinformation and disinformation. Conspiracy theories are one example, but there's also just plain old propaganda or deliberate efforts to mislead people or well-meaning efforts to challenge something that is a scientific or cultural orthodoxy with information that might be worse or might not be verified, etc. The difference between misinformation and disinformation relies on that. Misinformation is wrong or is poorly vetted. Disinformation actively attempts to deceive. And there might be a mix of both. And social media is a great place to magnify those things. So there's a book by Pomerantsev that'll be on the list that I think we'll provide to you called This Is Not Propaganda, that documents all of this for the global disinformation economy. And Pomerantsev looked at all these different places. So businesses and government agencies in Russia that set up social media accounts and have them amplify stories that happen that they think will cause social discord in the United States, or accounts in the Philippines that supported Duterte and modified evidence or tried to bury stories and so on that were negative to him. There's lots and lots of examples of this. Propaganda is ancient, obviously, but social media makes it so much more insidious in a certain way because it lets you kind of push propaganda as if it came from people that the user knows rather than coming directly from the government or from an agency that seems that it will benefit from it. We'll talk a little bit more about propaganda towards the end. But while we're talking about disinformation, one thing I think is important to point out is this: disinformation and misinformation aren't exclusive to one particular political philosophy or one particular political party. It happens all over the place. So before, all the liberals get really smug about conservative sheep falling for Republican fake news, it also happens on the left. When Osama bin Laden died, for example, if you were on Facebook when Osama bin Laden died, there was this quote that was circulated. It was shared by millions and millions of people. This is the quote: "I will mourn the loss of thousands of precious lives, but I will not rejoice in the death of one, not even an enemy. Returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." Martin Luther King. It's a great quote. It's beautiful and poetically said. And I was on Facebook at the time. I saw literally hundreds of my friends share this exact quote, often with a picture of Dr. King right next to it. The problem is that he didn't say that. The first line, "I will mourn the loss of thousands of precious lives, but I will not rejoice in the death of one, not even an enemy," is awfully on the nose, don't you think? He didn't say that part. He said the second part in, he wrote it actually in a book, but didn't say the first part. Someone who was actually a Penn State graduate student who was teaching English in Japan, named Jessica Dovey, someone posted the first sentence, which is her opinion about what had just happened, and then Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote from a book that she had read, which he actually did say. She wasn't intending to mislead anyone, but that status then got copied and shared as if the first sentence, her introductory sentence, and the quote were all one. Millions and millions of people shared this on the authority of Dr. King, even though he never said that. The more recent, and that's an example of misinformation. An example of disinformation happened in Alabama, where Doug Jones defeated Roy Moore in 2017, which is an election that a lot of people paid a lot of attention to, and you're probably aware of. What you might not be aware of is how the Democrats used disinformation in that campaign. There were a couple of different ways that this happened. There was a project called Project Birmingham, which was a literal conspiracy to make it look like Roy Moore was being supported by Russian bots. They tried to post things that supported Roy Moore that were written in such a way that it would look like they came from a Russian disinformation operation. They even used Cyrillic characters, Russian writing and stuff sometimes, as if like any Russian troll accidentally writes something, switches keyboards to use the Cyrillic commands instead of the Roman commands, but whatever. And they posted things to make it look like the Russians were supporting Roy Moore. They even started a Facebook campaign that thanked Roy Moore for prohibition. They had all these ads that said, it's great that Roy Moore wants to outlaw alcohol in Alabama. It's great that Roy Moore is going to make sure that you can't buy liquor in the state, so on and so forth. None of that was real. The point in doing it is that it looked like these were his supporters, and it looked like, therefore, he supported prohibition in Alabama, which they hoped would peel off some moderate voters, or at least those deeply committed to the consumption of alcohol in Alabama. All fake. It was all, it was essentially a false flag operation where they described what they were doing as what Roy Moore was doing, even though it wasn't. And this is all well documented. You can find examples of this. So the reason I'm using these two examples from the left is that there are lots and lots of examples of this on the right, and we're usually more familiar with that. But the point is that once the strategy exists, once the potential of social media to magnify disinformation and misinformation becomes obvious, it's difficult to imagine how just one group would use it. Instead, these tactics kind of replicate. They take on a life of their own, and they distort information, and people can always justify it to themselves. Well, I'm doing this to help other people, and so on and so forth. And it splits into different categories. So disinformation is deliberate, yes, but a lot of misinformation is probably well-intended. It's just accidental, and it happens to be wrong. Or people are very opinionated, but not very expert on some subject. The coronavirus is a great example of this. If you've been on social media and your filter bubble isn't all that strong, then you have for sure been exposed to people who say maybe the virus isn't real, or maybe the vaccines have these negative effects. There's all sorts of different versions of this. Bill Gates is microchipping you, or magnets will stick to your arm after you get the shot, which is one of my favorites that I saw in one of these groups, so on and so forth. You'll get the coronavirus from the vaccine. All that stuff is wrong, but a lot of the people who are sharing it don't mean to deceive necessarily. They mean to do the opposite. But because social media magnifies anyone's opinion, it's easy to overwhelm the opinion of experts or the sort of scientific takes on these exact same things. So this is bad, obviously, but it gets worse, or at least weirder. And one way that it does is that none of this stuff is really accidental. And what I mean is the power of social media to amplify misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories. The power of, social media to undermine trust in scientific truth. All of that stuff is really kind of baked into the design. And we're going to talk about this a lot more when we talk about the attention economy next week. But social media its business model isn't really about you, except as raw material. If you are viewing videos and you're clicking on things and you're interacting with social media, that does two things. One, it generates ad revenue directly for some of them, because they can say, look how many people interact with this, et cetera, and sell advertising space. But it also generates data. It generates extremely valuable data about how much time you spend looking at what, and what kinds of things you like, what kinds of things that people who like this also like, what kinds of things your friends like, how your friends interact with the things you like, and so on. All of those things, are part of the business model. That's how social media makes its money. It contributes to a marketing strategy that's called hypersegmentation. Instead of splitting the public up into a few different demographics or a few interest groups or whatever, and selling products to them, hypersegmentation means that you can split groups down into very, very small units. Netflix is a good example of this too, not social media so much, but House of Cards was a television show that was mostly designed by algorithms. They found that there was a significant group of people who liked Kevin Spacey, I remember, and also liked American adaptation, and so on and so forth. Also watched political. If all of those things sort of overlap in a Venn diagram, they figured we can market directly to these people. We'll make a television show that appeals to them, and it might not appeal to a ton of people, but they'll really, really like it, which means it will create a devoted audience. That's hypersegmentation. And social media is particularly good at magnifying this. So for example, one more example, and then we'll move on. But I was writing a book about how people imagine nuclear war and the end of the world. Don't worry about that. But buy it. It's called Desiring the Bomb. It's on Amazon, and I get like 4 cents every time you buy a copy. When I was writing that book, one of the chapters is about survivalism. So I spent a lot of time looking at what kind of axe you want when the world ends, and how to eat the neighbors, and so on and so forth. Not really, in case the neighbors are watching this. Don't worry, you're fine. But I had to read all that stuff. It was part of the research. Very quickly, I started to see ads. I unblocked them actually to see whether this effect was real. I started seeing ads for like, would you like to buy 30 years worth of freeze-dried food? That's not random. Those things are targeted. I studied Russian history partly for a long time. Gmail was like really insistent. Google's ad service is really insistent that I was interested in Russian bride services abroad. So there was this period in time when I was writing this book where I was getting nothing really but ads for like survival axes, dehydrated food, and Russian brides. It sounds like an exciting life, but it's not really me. The point is that all of this information can be kind of chewed up, digested, and spit back to identify a demographic that's extremely narrow and marketed too. Social media contributes to that. That is why, hoping that this problem disintegrates on its own, that social media companies become more responsible, is extremely unlikely to succeed, because creating filter bubbles is part of their business model. It's part of the way that social media sustains itself. It's the way that it gathers data, and it directly contributes to it. Asking these companies, who are probably not creating filter bubbles and radicalizing folks and so on, they're probably not doing it on purpose, but asking them to regulate their content is essentially asking them to do something that they know is against their own financial interests. That the model of social media operates by addiction, which we'll talk about next week, and hypersegmentation, of creating these little bubbles that are mutually reinforcing and tell people what they want to hear, bring them into contact with each other, and create tiny little virulent markets, and also rewards for the people who participate in them. They get to encounter people that they wouldn't otherwise encounter who agree with them. And that's not always insidious, by the way. Many marginalized communities can find each other on social media. It's a way that people can connect who otherwise wouldn't have the opportunity to do that, and so on. So the point isn't that it's all evil, but some of it for sure is. And that's the part about conspiracy theories, disinformation, etc. The result of this dynamic is political polarization, partly. That's one result. The hardest thing to realize, I think, about these divides on social media is this. Everybody's probably encountered it's usually a family member, and the reason it's a family member is because you filtered out everybody else who doesn't already agree with you. But everybody has one family member who has beliefs that are diametrically opposed to them. You and Uncle Jimbo fight over the turkey about whether lizard people control the government or whatever every Thanksgiving. Uncle Jimbo isn't reading the same stuff that you are, and then coming to the conclusion that there's lizard people controlling the government. The two of you don't even interact with the same information. In other words, you don't know what the other side knows, and they don't know what you know. And I'm using the word know really loosely here. What I mean is that you essentially exist in different worlds. Or here's another metaphor. You live in different ecosystems of information where the things you're exposed to, they are never exposed to. And the things that you're exposed to, and vice versa, the things they're exposed to, you're never exposed to. That there's very little overlap that provides a common basis for discussion or deliberation, or even to determine what's true and what's false. Instead, we kind of fall into believing that everyone else is evil rather than just wrong. And that's the hardest part. That's the part that I think is so hard to realize about this. Across political divides that exist due to the polarization that's in part caused by, and certainly evident on social media, across those divides, it's not even necessarily true that values are all that different between people, but the way that they're expressed and the things that go into informing them and translating them into very specific, concrete beliefs about the world, those things are wholly different. So imagine that you're a leopard seal for a second. Don't worry, this metaphor is going somewhere. You're a leopard seal. You think everyone should eat penguins. That's what leopard seals eat. Uncle Jimbo is a polar bear. And you think that Uncle Jimbo should eat penguins and that he's an idiot because Uncle Jimbo doesn't even know what a penguin is and certainly won't eat them. The problem is Uncle Jimbo doesn't even know what a penguin is. Leopard seals live in the Antarctic, so do penguins. Polar bears live in the Arctic, no penguins. The two of them have no interaction. When you prescribe belief for other people across one of these informational divides that exists as a result of the kind of splintering of social media and media in general, it's not so much that the other person is ignoring the information that you've seen. They almost certainly just haven't seen it. And if you present it to them, instead of correcting a deficit, i.e., instead of saying, oh, well, you didn't see this stuff, here it is, now this fills a gap for you. Instead of filling gaps in each other's knowledge, we just contribute to this massive proliferation of information. What you present is just more crap. It's just more words. It's just more digital representations of stuff that compound billions of other digital representations of stuff that other people are exposed to. So it isn't about sharing information to fix things for one another. The problem is deeper than that. The problem is about a lack of consensus about what even constitutes good information. And this is the problem that we've talked about already with conspiracy theories and propaganda. Conspiracy theorists aren't ready to change their minds because you share some article from the Huffington Post, let's say, about why their conspiracy theory is wrong. Or you share some article from, I don't know, Newsmax about why their conspiracy theory is wrong. They aren't ready to do that because simply contradicting something that someone already believes rarely moves the needle. It doesn't change their mind most of the time. It confirms to them that you're on the other side. And so they can filter out what you're saying automatically. It's expected that you disagree with each other. If you are on the left, it's expected that the right disagrees with what you believe. So you can use that as a filter to block out a lot of information. If you're on the right, it's expected that the left, tells you what they believe and that they disagree with you. And so you can filter out a lot of that information. It's why my job is extremely difficult in some ways. I research extremists and conspiracy theories and things like that. I'm a college professor. If I say that they're wrong, that's part of the narrative. They expect me to say that. They think, all liberal college professors, all of them believe the same thing. It's all part of this cultural hegemony and so on, where people, elitists don't believe the kind of things that we do and so on and so forth. When I just say a conspiracy theory is wrong, for the theorists, for the most part, that confirms what they already believe. I'm playing the part that they've already assigned me, which makes it extremely difficult to wear some of this stuff out. And a direct response to this kind of problem is easily identifiable as a direct response. There's a distinction about propaganda that was made by Jacques Ellul. Ellul was a French theorist of technology. The important thing that we're talking about today is not his work on technology, but a book that he wrote about propaganda. And one of the distinctions that Ellul made as far back as the late 50s, early 60s, Ellul said, there are two kinds of propaganda, vertical and horizontal. Vertical propaganda is what we traditionally think of as propaganda. The Uncle Sam poster saying, we need you for the US Army, or all of those kind of like Soviet constructivist posters and so on and so forth, or socialist realist posters with, Lenin lived, Lenin lives, Lenin shall always live, that kind of thing. Those are vertical propaganda. The state, the organization, is telling you directly, interacting with you in a kind of atomized individual way about what you should believe. There's that. But more insidious in some ways is horizontal propaganda, where people who aren't your superiors or aren't part of the government or the corporation that's propagandizing you or whatever, they're just regular people like you. When those people share opinions with you that are essentially propagandistic, it's a lot harder to identify. So Ellul made this distinction between vertical and horizontal propaganda long before social media existed in its kind of modern state, but it seems particularly relevant here. One of the hard parts of filtering out propaganda is just knowing that it's propaganda at all. The vertical part is really easy, but the horizontal part is a lot harder. So QAnon, again, is a great example of this. A lot of QAnon and vaccine skepticism stuff, both of those, are spread now on Instagram by wellness influencers. So you might see like, 30 photographs of someone's yoga poses, and then all of a sudden someone's like, I'm not so sure that the vaccine is natural and that's the kind of thing that we should support, and so on. Or QAnon folks who are just like, I'm really worried about children and sex trafficking, which are real problems, but then sort of lead that into a broader thing that's like, and Wayfair is smuggling children inside cabinets and so on and so forth, all the weird stuff. So it sounds like a thorny problem. So what do we do about this? Well, you're in luck. Here's the one secret trick that Zuckerberg doesn't want you to know. You ready? No, I'm just kidding. I don't really have an answer for this. So no one's going to solve this problem. No one. Disinformation is probably as old as information. And I mean that quite literally. So here's an example of how this is so hard to solve. And this, I promise, this will get into a quasi solution in a minute. There's a great book by Mercier and Sperber called The Enigma of Reason. And Mercier and Sperber were two scientists who are interested in explaining how human reason works, like why we do it the way that we do and what distinguishes the way that we do it from other animals. And their conclusion is really disturbing, but helps explain a lot of the phenomena that we're talking about today. We aren't really wired, our brains aren't really made to make good rational decisions by processing evidence and then coming to solid logical conclusions. Instead, what we're really, really good at is persuasion. We're really good at making arguments. We persuade ourselves, but we persuade each other even better. So here's an example of this. So like imagine that you're a monkey. Okay, so two monkeys. And imagine that you're a monkey that knows an awful lot for a monkey about poisoned berries. So you find some new red berries on a tree, and maybe they're poisonous and you die if you eat them, or maybe they're a great source of food and you're just like the boss of all the monkeys now because you're the one who found their new food. If you know a lot about poison berries for a monkey, let's say you're right like 70% of the time. That means 7 out of 10 times you'll be the boss of all the monkeys. The other 3 times though, dead, super dead. You ate the poison berries, you're dead, dead monkey. However, if instead of using all that brain power to know a lot about the difference between poisoned and non-poisoned berries, you use all that brain power to convince the other monkey that that monkey should try the berries, you'll survive 100% of the time. Because if they are poisonous, the other monkey dies. If they're not poisonous, then you still found the berries. You're still the boss of all the monkeys. That's what we're evolved to do. And that's what we do best. We're best at persuading other people that we know what we're doing. We're better at that than actually knowing what we're doing, which is one reason why disinformation spreads the way that it does. And one reason that disinformation is as old as information. That we're creatures to some degree founded on our capacity for manipulating each other and spreading propaganda. That's what we are, little propagandist monkeys. So polarization, conspiracy theories, none of these things are new. They've been around forever. What do? One idea comes from a distinction between agonism and antagonism. This is the sort of core of this. An antagonistic relationship is one where the other side is wrong, evil, can't be allowed, has to be destroyed. An agonistic relationship is one in which the other side is wrong and you never have to agree with them or even necessarily compromise with them, but you understand them as being legitimate. What I mean by that is that one solution to political polarization, it's been suggested by 2 political theorists named Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau. One solution to political polarization is not so much to try to make everybody agree, because that doesn't work for the most part. Remember, we're all nasty little monkeys at the core. But if people accept the opposition as legitimate, which doesn't mean believing anything that they say, an agonistic relationship is possible. One that isn't based on compromise, it's based on conflict still, but conflict that stops short of the kind of full shutdown and polarization that seems to be the case on social media now. So there's not a lot of great research on this. But here are a couple of other ideas, and then we'll stop for questions. I have 3 things to suggest about this. How do you deal with the social consequences of social media yourself online? Number 1 is that it's usually pointless to try to win arguments. There's a quote attributed to Mark Twain, although I don't know if he really said this, and it would be embarrassing if I got this wrong on a discussion about disinformation and misinformation. There's a quote attributed to Mark Twain that you can't argue with an idiot because they'll drag you down to their level and beat you with experience. That's the whole internet. That's it. That's the YouTube comments section. He figured it out. If someone posts something that you is wrong and politically motivated and you disagree with it, your chance of convincing them by saying that they're wrong is pretty close to 0. In fact, there's a researcher named Diane Mutz who does great work on deliberation. And her conclusion is that most of the time you will make those people dig in and believe what they believe more. Again, because you're the scripted opposition. That's the way it's supposed to work. There's a recent study done by a scientist at Cambridge, whose name I don't remember right now, on Twitter that tested this theory. It found a bunch of posts where someone said something controversial, someone else responded to them, and it tried to see how the OP responded. Almost always that person digs in. They become more radical, not less, and they fight back. So trying to win arguments isn't usually the way to do it. And this leads to number 2, don't walk away though either. Just because you can't win an argument on the internet, which is like mathematically impossible if you've ever been on the internet and argued with anyone, just because you can't win an argument on the internet doesn't mean that you can't engage at all. A strange aspect of filter bubbles that we don't often think of is that if you have good information, you tend to form your own filter bubble too. We think of conspiracy theorists, for example, just talking to each other. But on the other hand, non-conspiracy theorists also just talk to each other. The people who think that the vaccine doesn't work mostly just talk to each other. People who think that the vaccine does work mostly just talk to each other. They don't engage all that much. If you drop out of a ecology where misinformation is spread, you give up an opportunity to be one of the resistors, essentially, in that ecology. In other words, the bubbles form both ways. They form by people isolating themselves to stay away from opinions that they don't like. Excuse me, but they also form by people dropping out of those bubbles. And this leads to number 3. If you can't win the arguments by directly opposing them, but dropping out is also dangerous, and then it helps these bubbles sort of stay stable. You have to find things that allow a dialogue to occur that still let you challenge disinformation, conspiracy theories, misinformation, without doing so in a kind of head-on hostile way. This is the Sun Tzu strategy. This is B.H. Liddell Hart's indirect approach, all that stuff. The quick thing that I'll say about this before questions is that the easiest way to find a point where you can talk to someone who has been swayed potentially by disinformation or conspiracy theory is to identify the places where your values do overlap, and then question whether the conclusions that they've drawn are a correct response to that overlap. For example, you might think that the QAnon people are totally wrong about everything. They are. They're totally wrong about everything. But at their core, QAnon conspiracy theorists often start with, but I really care about children. If that's something you can relate to, then you've got a point where you can say, I also care about children. However, don't you think that a better way to address the same issue might be X, etc.? This is really hard to do because, especially online, the rewards for just calling someone an idiot and giving them the old middle finger emoji and moving on are really high and really immediate. You feel great about yourself, but they don't do anything in the long run. It feels kind of icky sometimes to engage someone like a QAnon supporter and even say some aspect of what you believe is true, but let's maybe talk about different directions to go from there. If your goal, though, is to feel good, then definitely take the like you're an idiot middle finger approach if you'd like. If your goal is to try to work against the aspects of social media that are destroying social cohesion, like disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy theories, then you'll have to try another approach, even if that approach is less satisfying in the short run, because ultimately the satisfaction of helping to break up a dangerous constellation of information should be much higher than the kind of initial returns, the like sugar-like returns of just calling someone an idiot. This is a big topic, and there's a lot of stuff that we had to leave out. Next week, we'll talk about what social media does to you, of course, what that might mean for your health and happiness. If something seemed abstract today, then remember that we're going to get to the details of the kind of bad romance between you and your phone and Twitter very soon. But let's use the rest of this time for questions on social effects, therefore. So questions, comments, concerns, you've got your own little filter bubble right here. So let's hear what you've got.
All right, thank you, Callum. While people think of questions, I won the battle of getting a live stream going with Facebook, but I lost the war of sticking with my agenda. So I am going to circle back to that poll I know all of you were dying to take and just ask you for your feedback right now. And this is just Zoom, but those on Facebook that have stuck with us, the question is on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest. How worried are you about social media's influence on other people's personal choices and beliefs? So for those that are here now, oh, we have 1 already for 5, very high worry, and another has given us a 4. Are there any folks out there in Zoom land who have no worries whatsoever about other people? I don't know. I think it's going to stay pretty high. All right, last chance to vote. Going once, going twice. All right, so we had 4 was the winner by a few, which didn't surprise me personally, but I am kind of interested that we had someone say a 3, so they're not as doomed and gloomed as our 5, perhaps. My other question for you all was about your personal choices and beliefs regarding social media's influence, and we had even more 3s for that one, with a 4, a couple 4s as well. So we'll give you a poll at the beginning for our next week program. But now, yes, any Q&A from our attendees, please share now. I'm checking our Q&A section. We are going to be providing the books that you heard about as a little handy dandy book list, and Callum is usually pretty great about sharing his contact info as well in the book list. So if you have any questions that you want to just ask him, you can. Last chance for questions before you're released into the non-screen of the world, hopefully. All right. So I'm going to just share my screen. Oh, wait, there we go. So we have, I'm always discouraged that I cannot even rely on economic ideas to persuade those on the right. Thoughts on that, Callum?
Yeah, that's hard. I think part of the difficulty that people have in economic arguments in particular is that they tend to be arguments that are really over values, but are presented as arguments that are over means. So in other words, they're over ends. Like, is an equitable distribution of income more important to you than overall economic growth, for example. But instead, we end up talking about things like which policy creates more jobs and so on and so forth. And it's not that those things don't matter, but it's, as a general rule, most of what I actually teach and do is teach people argument. It's way harder to persuade someone to change their values than it is to convince them that one path is more or less likely to fulfill those values. And economic arguments, I think, are tough because they seem like they should be easy. They seem like you should be able to say, this is a set of at least verifiable principles. If you think economics is like a real verifiable science, which is questionable, but if you think that, then this is a set of common elements that we can share, and we could look at research and so on to figure out which of these things is better. But a lot of those arguments don't go anywhere in the end because, just as you said, they tend not to be persuasive because people's values are really at question in a lot of them, even if they pretend that they're not. So yeah, that's really tough. I like, though, the strategy of trying to figure out what's important to the group that you're talking to and making the conversation about that. Another thing that's hard, I think, to internalize about dealing with political polarization, especially in the context of disinformation, is that most of the time you'll fail. Like, if you're very, very good at persuading other people that your ideas are right, you'll still fail most of the time. It's about like kind of marginal improvements rather than a total breakdown. The kind of person who you can have an argument with, and after 5 minutes, they just like surrender and crumple into a little crying ball and decide that whatever you said is right is what they're doing for the rest of their life. You probably don't really need to persuade that person anyway. Like, anything will do it. Strongly worded Kleenex ads will persuade that person. The people that you're after aren't the people who already disagree with you for the most part. The people where you can make the biggest difference are people who haven't quite decided yet. And even in that case, sometimes you'll win, sometimes you won't. And it's difficult to accept that this is really about, small but expanding differences that individuals make in spaces where you aren't, for the most part, fighting with your opponents. You're competing over people who haven't quite made up their minds yet. But that's the easiest thing to do, unfortunately.
All right, and then we had another more commenting question. 50 years ago, my bubble was blindsided by a parent's comments about the Kent May 4th shootings. And I'm not sure if they have any more to elaborate on that, but definitely it never feels good to have your bubble blindsided in any regard, especially by family.
Yeah, Kent State was one of those, I think, kind of iconic opportunities in a way. I think a lot of people changed what they thought about not the war necessarily in Vietnam, but the way, trust of government and security and so on, when they saw the photographs of people who were shot on campus and so on. It unfortunately sometimes takes kind of dramatic eruptions that are beyond one individual's persuasive capacity to make something like that happen. I think the Kennedy assassination was like that for a lot of people too.
All right, last chance for questions. I also just realized I may have had the chat disabled. So, there's not enough fun stuff happening with technology, and I've only been using Zoom for over a year. So, nailing it. Don't see anything else in our Q&A.
You can always ask things next week too, if they come to you later.
Please consider joining us next week. I'm sharing our screen now. Social media and me addiction by design. We also have contact information here for both Callum and myself, as well as that URL to watch the previous Navigating Information Fatigue programs on our YouTube channel, but they're also available on our website at this link. So I want to thank everyone for being here, and stop share, last chance, excellent. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and you can join us next Thursday.